Ryan Bell.
Jerel de Leon. Alright. The Early Industrial Revolution, Chapter 22. 1760 to 1851, Mr. Blue Prius. Alright, the cause of the Industrial Revolution. There was population growth, increasingly larger population in Europe. For example, England and Wales had populations of 5.5 million in 1688, 9 million in 1801, and 18 million in 1851. There was also widespread resistance to disease and more reliable food supplies such as corn and potatoes from the Americas. The food supply and job opportunities increased. People married younger, had more children, and the younger population increased the workforce. There was also immigration to the colonies in America. The agricultural revolution increased food production provided for a working urban class. Potatoes yielded 2 or 3 times more food per acre than wheat did, and corn, turnips, legumes, and clover could also be fed to cattle, and cow manure was used as a fertilizer. Rural tenant and subsistence farmers could not take a risk on trying something new. Large landowners had the land enclosed, and they were given titles to land that had once been common land. Enclosure forced small-scale farmers to move to cities or emigrate. There was also trade and inventiveness. Population growth demanded improvements. Roads were improved to allow stagecoaches to travel faster. Additional craftsmen were trained to create china, silk, and carpet production, and there were the cotton industries emerging, and the merchants would drop off supplies and pick up finished products, which led to increased trade that the middle class could afford tea, sugar, cotton textiles, iron hardware, and pottery, which led to science, increased production, and trade. The inventions helped increase trade. Benjamin Franklin experimented with electricity. The Montgolfier brothers created the hot air balloon. Claude Chapman was the first semaphore telegraph. Eli Whitney and John Hall made machines that made other machines work a lot more efficiently. There was also Britain and continental Europe, which led to economic growth in the North Atlantic. Great Britain, rising standard of living in the 18th century came from good harvests, a growing population, and overseas trade. Mining and metal industries willing to experiment, and the largest merchant marine produced more ships. There was also the political and social differences. Monarch and nobility held less power than in France, Spain, and Austria. Power was not as centralized as the other monarchies. Class lines were not sharply drawn. The government contained fewer bureaucrats. Intermarriage between classes was common, and guilds were weak and could not effectively resist change. Transportation led to navigable rivers and canal system, coastline with safe harbors, no tolls, and travel by water was cheaper than overland trade. Continental Europe had a higher transportation costs, rigid social structures, government regulations, and between 1789 and 1815 there were many wars. Industrialization began after the Revolutionary Wars in Belgium and northern France. Then Britain went to continental Europe to begin industrialization. There were abundant coal and iron deposits, and by the 1850s France, Belgium, and Germany states were in the middle of an industrial boom based on iron, cotton, steam, engines, and railroads.
The technological revolution. Mass production. Pottery industry. Necessary because the cost of pottery from China was high. The middle class interest in tea, coffee, and cocoa made it necessary. Josiah Wedgwood developed a pyrometer, used division of labor to produce china cheap enough for the middle class, and created identical plates and cups. He also purchased a steam engine for his factory, one of the first times an engine was used in a factory. This allowed him to lower his costs, increase quality, and employed several hundred workers. Mechanization. The cotton industry. Largest industry in this period. Due to high costs, Europeans wanted to import cotton fiber and made it into cloth. In 1764, the spinning jenny turned cotton fibers into thread. 1769, the water frame was introduced by Richard Arkwright. Spun strong fibers, needed water power, and it required no linen. In 1785, the mule Samuel Crompton, finest thread available. Weaving technology had to keep up, so in 1784, the power loom, perfected by 1815, was introduced. By the 1830s, large English factories powered by steam engines could turn cotton fiber into printed cloth. The price of cloth fell by 90% between 1782 and 1812. This made cotton America's most valuable crop. In 1793, cotton gin Eli Whitney separated the seeds. Cotton plantations spread through the South. American cotton industry by the 1820s. The iron industry. Iron had been used in Africa and Asia for thousands of years. Song China was using cast iron. Iron processing led to the deforestation, which drove prices up. Iron was rare and valuable outside of China before the 18th century. In Britain, experiments with different fuel sources to smelt the iron occurred. They used coal in which the impurities have been cooked out instead of charcoal. They made raw iron fairly cheap, less destructive to forests, cheap and useful, and used it to build the Crystal Palace. Cheap iron led to mass production of guns, hardware, and tools. Manufacturers turned to identical parts, and by mid-19th century, interchangeable parts were used in firearms, farm equipment, and sewing machines. The steam engine was the first machine to transform fossil fuels into mechanical energy. Developed in 1702 through 1712, Thomas Newcomen, the inventor, a substitute for animal, human, wind, and water power, more powerful and didn't tire, set the Industrial Revolution apart from earlier periods of growth and innovation. James Watt, 1769, improved the steam engine, patented his idea, used less fuel than the Newcomen engine, soon used in mines, flour and cotton mills, pottery manufacturing, and used on riverboats by 1790, opened the United States up to movement on rivers and canals, not used in ocean-going ships until technology improved. Railroads. First steam locomotive, 1825, Great Britain, after much improvement to the engine. The first rails connected mines, cities, and ports. Soon passenger trains were developed. Railroads were faster, cheaper, and more comfortable. Soon railroads covered Eastern America and opened the Midwest to settlers. Communication over wires. The first telegraph was formed in the early 1800s. After the invention of the battery, Samuel Morse developed a code called the Morse code. Railroad companies used telegraphs first. The lines were run along the tracks, announced the departure and arrival of the trains. In 1851, first submarine cables across the English Channel were introduced, and communication increased.
The impact of the early Industrial Revolution. New industrial cities led to dramatic environmental changes in the cities. Both cities and towns grew quicker than ever, and some individuals became very prosperous. There were homes, churches, museums, and theaters built in wealthy neighborhoods. The largest population increase was among the poor, which led to unhealthy living conditions in tenements, overcrowded row houses, and several families were often forced to live in one room. Urban problems grew more serious. People threw their sewer and trash out the windows to the streets. The poor kept pigs and chickens while the rich kept horses. Factories caused air and water pollution. The water was contaminated by the sewage industrial runoff, and railroads brought noise and pollution. These conditions brought about diseases such as smallpox, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Rickets were also caused from a lack of sunshine. Cholera was caused on ships from India, and the average lifespan in England in the 1850s was 40, and in Manchester was 24 and only 17 in the poorest neighborhood. Municipal reforms brought change in the mind of the 19th century with garbage removal, water and sewage systems, parks and schools. The rural environments almost had all been altered by humans before the Industrial Revolution in Britain through pastures and farmland. Then there was deforestation. They used timber to build ships and houses, used to heat homes and manufacture bricks, iron, glass, beer, bread, and other items. The American environment changed even faster. American and Canadian governments seized land from natives, made it available at low cost to white farmers, shipped lumber to Britain, and the cotton plantations cut forests, grew cotton, and depleted the soil, moved on. The Americans thought of nature as an obstacle. Industrialization helped the environment in Europe. They did not rely on wood for building ships or powering industry, and there was new transformation that the governments did not pay attention to roads, canal systems were built, and so were railroads. The working conditions. Carpenters, metalworkers, and machinists in great demand. Some workers became engineers, some took their knowledge to other places. The majority worked for low pay, repetitive and boring tasks. Long workdays with few breaks and accidents were very common. The industrial work for women was away from home. Women usually worked in textile industries and made one-third to one-half of what men made. They left their babies with nurses who were very expensive, or brought them to work and drugged them around. Domestic services were another option, but the risk of sexual abuse and low pay were very high. Many tried to work at home doing laundry and sewing. Child labor. Working parents brought their children to work because there were no schools. Child labor was cheaper. They were better at moving around the machines. Factories usually hired orphans and often had them work a 14 to 16 hour a day and were beaten if they made mistakes or fell asleep. Children often worked in mines as well because of their small size. In the American industry, textile mills were tended to hire women, but offered a moral dormitory lifestyle for unmarried women. Soon, longer hours, harsher working conditions, and lower wages took a hold of such things. Then there was slavery in the South. It continued to grow strong because of the booming textile industry and demand for coffee and sugar. Then there was changes in society. Business cycles were recurrent swings from economic hard times to recovery and growth, then back to hard times. Handloom weavers became destitute, and factory workers suffered from high food prices and a few years later would be able to afford semi-luxury goods. The Hungry Forties occurred from 1847 to 1848, where potato crops failed in Ireland and one-fourth of the Irish population died. The workers' standard of living really improved after the 1850s, causing cheaper food, clothing, and utensils to be available. Some industrialists buy their way into high society, but middle-class women became responsible for the home, the servants, the education of the children, and the family's social life. The middle-class success stories believed in the power of the individual, that most had the power to work their way up to wealth, that those that did not succeed should blame themselves, and they claimed moral superiority and felt helplessness against low-class drunkenness, prostitution, and child abandonment.
The laissez-faire and his critics. The laissez-faire, developed by Adam Smith, who was an economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations. If individuals are allowed to seek personal gain, it would increase the general welfare. Government should stay out of business except to protect private property. It should allow duty-free trade with other countries and capitalism, not mercantilism. Smith persuaded governments reduce trade regulations after 1815. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo blamed the workers' troubles on high population. This encouraged later marriage and abstinence. The laissez-faire encouraged banks, stock markets, and joint stock companies and with popular businessmen. Positivists and utopian socialism. Positivism was a scientific method that could solve social and technical problems. Concern for the poor recommended that the poor guided by scientists and artists from workers' communities. Workers seemed uninterested. Utopian socialism. Charles Fourier imagined an ideal society where groups of workers would live in dormitories and would work together on the land and workshops. They would have pastries and wine. Protests and reforms. Workers benefited little from these ideas and reforms. Changed jobs frequently, often absent, and their quality of work was often poor. Periodically rioted and went on strike. This did not change the industries. Workers joined together to form societies based on getting universal male suffrage and shorter workdays. Mass movements persuaded Parliament to look into industrial workers' lives. The Factory Act of 1833 prohibited the employment of children younger than 9 in textile mills. It also limited the working hours of children. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited the employment of women and the employment of boys under age 10 underground. Corn laws repealed in 1846. The tariffs on imported grain were dropped.
Industrialization in the non-industrial world. Non-industrialized regions were selling raw materials to industrialized nations. China no longer had the best manufactured goods. India and Egypt were receiving cheap industrial imports, which delayed their own industrialization. Finally, Great Britain used steam-powered steel warships to attack China, and this small country was ready to expand again.